Okay, good evening and welcome. This is Plato and Deleuze, a second lecture in a Free University of Brighton course. If you're part of the Free University of Brighton, then there will be a seminar at 8 o'clock on River. If you're not part of the Free University of Brighton and you want to ask questions or follow along, there is a Discord at my Twitch page. You can link to there. So this week I want to talk about the Phaedrus and about the way Plato presents his arguments in the Phaedrus, and also about the way in which Deleuze reads that. So there's a kind of different levels and layers here. I'm just going to switch a big light off. So I just switched that on when I was earlier. So yeah, there's kind of the Phaedrus itself, the way in which the Phaedrus is staged, and then Deleuze's reading of this. And so one of the ways I want to start by doing that is by talking a little bit about maybe one of the ways in which we would normally perhaps read some of Plato. And so that means looking at this idea of essence and reality and idea, and there's going to be a kind of movement or a difference between those three terms, as well as a similarity that's hopefully of interest. Hopefully we can find a tease out that kind of similarities and differences. And the way of doing this, I think, is by thinking of the way in which we might normally read if we were sort of saying, let's say, doing a traditional reading of Plato, the way in which we might normally read this is to put front and centre this distinction between reality and appearance. This is what we see in the cave, for example. So in the cave we see things as they really are once we've kind of realised that the way things seem, the appearance is a projection, and the real light comes from outside, and this is a metaphor for seeing with more than just your eyes, seeing more than what's just in front of you. This is a metaphor for using the intellect. And so the intellect is what enables us to sort of get past appearance, get at reality. And this is, I think, it is clearly, in a sense, what Plato is doing, or what Socrates is arguing at certain points. But that's, I think, it is a particular way in which we can read Plato. Alongside the cave, obviously, we have that thing called the divided line, which I mentioned last week. And the divided line essentially gives us a kind of a series of different ways or forms of seeing, from basic images that we might sort of think of as just pure sensation, to the types of things that we can see cats and dogs and we can distinguish things, to sort of geometric relations, being able to sort of understand the relationships between triangles and circles, to ideas, and there's each way in which those things are seen is slightly different and involves more and more of the intellect. And there's a kind of transition point, the divided line, from images and types of things, images and kind of, understanding a little bit. There's a transition point to kind of the abstract moment. And so the universal, for example, when we think of what makes a cat, what makes dogs, what makes types of things, actually, as soon as we begin to think about the actual notion of type, we're kind of doing more than just seeing the type, just seeing the kind. We're doing more than just identifying them. Now, at the heart of for Plato, at the heart of all of this is this idea, form, kind of structure. So the true world, the real world, reality is encountered in terms of its essence, and in terms of its idea, often referred to as the form. So this is just to kind of recap this a little bit. I was talking a little bit about this sort of notions of the cave, form, the divided line last week, and now I'm just kind of putting it in terms of essence and appearance a little bit more. But here's something that we want to think about in terms of, what exactly is an essence? One of the ways in which, for example, we might have distinguished our essence from our appearance is by saying something like the essence It's something that X must have. So that it's some kind of property that the object must have. It's a necessary sort of property of the object, whereas an accident is something that some kind of property that the object might have and is a contingent. And so what we're doing there is we're making a distinction between essence and appearance, using this concept of possibility. It's what we might call a modal distinction. Modal just refers to anything that is kind of talking about possibilities. Now there's a kind of difficulty here, and if you're interested, you can go and look at the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on essence and appearance, and it will kind of take you into this argument. I'm not going to go into this argument, and I'm not going to go into all the kind of difficulties in using, say, a possibility model, a modal model, to make the distinction between essence and appearance. You can go and look at the Stanford Encyclopedia page, but roughly speaking, there's a kind of a sort of intuitive way we can kind of get the problem, which is if something's kind of a necessary property of an object, does that object have to exist? Is there, in other words, a possible world in which that object doesn't exist? In which case, there seems to be a possible world in which that object doesn't exist, except that object seems to have a necessary property. And so we kind of can't work out, in a sense, whether we've got the essence there. We seem to have a kind of confusion or a difficulty around possibilities and possible worlds. But I think we kind of can get the basics, is that an essence is something, that something must have. An essence is something an object must have. That which is not the essence, that which kind of we might call the accident or we might call the appearance, is kind of just the way in which the object is presented at the moment. Now this is obviously, boiling down really complicated distinctions into short little descriptions, and so we can kind of just bearing in mind that there is that kind of distinction between essence and appearance, and this is this is the normal way perhaps in which we might read Plato. Let me just put that on silent. Then what we might ask is, how does that essence concept work inside Plato? So the question we could ask is, how do we see an essence, as it were, in action in Plato, in the arguments? And one of the ways we might want to say, well, we clearly see Socrates using some sort of concept of essence is when he does his first speech in response to Lysias. Where he begins from this approach of defining terms. And he says, there's little point in us engaging in a kind of discussion or argument here if we're not talking about the same thing. If we don't define our terms, then we're just gonna go astray, and we're going to end up talking past each other. It's that kind of position that he's putting forward there. As to motivate why to define terms, and what we need to think about is, well, in a sense, isn't the process of defining terms the setting up of a kind of essence? As we do that definition, as we engage in that definition, we're kind of setting the terms of what we think the object is. And in this case, he's trying to setting the terms of what he thinks the object of the lover is. Now, it's important there, he's not setting the object of love. Okay, it's important that he's talking about the lover. Because it's only on that basis that we can actually, and that distinction is important because this is how he does his definition. His definition is to refer to love and to talk about it as a desire, and then he asks about how to distinguish someone who's in love from someone who's not in love, and then he uses something like a structure of the human being in which love takes place in the form of the lover. But that structure kind of structures the way in which love takes place in the form of the lover. And that structure is that we have a twofold nature. We have desire and we have judgment. Roughly speaking, judgment's going to be this intellect bit. And when desire is in charge, Socrates says, and this is still him defining his terms, remember, when desire is in charge, we have outrageousness, some of the translations give some excess. We have excess. But when judgment is in charge, we're in a kind of, sometimes the phrase is we're in our right mind. Remember, this is him defining his terms in that first speech as to what a lover is. And it's only on the basis of that kind of setting up of that character, that kind of set of terms as to what the thing is, that the rest of the discussion moves forward. And what he does in that first speech is because he's kind of already agreed that that there is a kind of sickness in being in love, which is Lysias's point. So he kind of makes the same kind of argument, but here, instead of it being a manipulation, it's essentially based upon the idea that the lover is someone who is just appetite driven. They're an excess of appetite over intellect. But all of that speech comes out of him setting up the terms in the first place. So as I say, that defining of terms almost looks like a kind of setting up an essence. And here we have to be careful of being trapped, because obviously as soon as you agree to the premises of an argument, you quite often agree to some implications. And so the same kind of thing here. As soon as you agree to certain terms being defined, there's certain other things might follow. But that's not the only way. I think that we see an essence, or what we might think of as something like that, being used. Now, I think in that first speech, what's interesting is that Socrates is going to renounce that first speech. It's going to be blasphemous. He's going to turn its back on it, and it's going to be the move to the second speech, in a sense that kind of is somehow more interesting, perhaps. But there's another way in which Socrates is kind of talking about something like an essence. This is a quote from Phaedrus 2:37. And let's bring this up for you. So love is a kind of desire. Everyone will admit that. But we know that one does not we know that one does not have to be in love to desire what is beautiful. And this next sentence, the one I've put in bold here, is the one in which he's kind of asking about essences again. How then are we to distinguish between a lover and his opposite? So this use of the opposite, this is another way in which we might encounter or get at an essence. And we can note a couple of things here. We can distinguish here, this distinguish between phrase. How then are we to distinguish between? We can read that as something like competition or selection. How do we select between options? Now this is why I was talking about Deleuze's reading. This is in a sense leading into Deleuze's reading of what Plato is doing here. And in some sense, he's trying to sort of, I think, point us to this other way in which essence is being used inside Plato. So that's one thing that's worth noticing, is that sort of distinguish between that kind of competition or selection. The process of selection is also in some sense a way or a route to essence inside Plato, perhaps, as well as the route of defining terms. Perhaps those are the possible options we might have. We'd have to fill them out a bit more yet. But the other thing to notice about that particular phrase is also the role of the opposite. Now, there's a lover and his opposite. Now, if we say the opposite of the lover is that which is not the lover, the problem with that is we're using this negation, we can almost include anything. I mean, the apple is not the lover. There's a lot of things that aren't the lover. So it's not really a negation. It's rather a question. The opposite is something that doesn't qualify, we might say. Something that doesn't qualify as the lover. It kind of is now. It has to not. This is a kind of strange thing about opposites, isn't it? It has to kind of not qualify as the thing, and also in some sense be it something like an inversion. There's a kind of strange relationship we have to an opposite. Not everything's the opposite of everything else, and that's obvious. So opposites can sometimes seem obvious. Black and white, we might think of obvious opposites, but a triangle and a circle aren't opposites. So what an opposite is not always obvious. Sometimes it is, obviously. But the distinction then is a kind of selective distinction, not a defining distinction in terms of the essence, and it's also not defined or not being worked with in terms of simply negation, but rather, in other words, not the lover, but rather kind of something specific kind of relation, of opposite, perhaps. Again, this is just to kind of begin to think about what we mean by essence, and we might begin to think about essence, different ways in which, we might say Plato is thinking about essence, but how exactly is he doing it? These are the kind of things we're trying to think about at the moment. Now, the question that would, push into Deleuze's reading, in a sense, is, and one in which when we get there, we might think about a bit more, is Plato offering a method of selection or of definition? We might want to say, in a sense, let's, have the definition reading of essence and the selection reading of essence, and we might want to push them hard and say, is it actually one or the other? Are they somehow so different they might be incompatible? For example, we probably wouldn't want to say in regard to something like evolution that it was a process of defining new species. Evolution is a kind of selection process, and we kind of understand how a selection process works. And we might want to argue that actually that's it's incompatible, or it's inapplicable when it comes to the realm of the intellect, which is the kind of point for Plato and Socrates, and so that we'd be using a kind of a model from the natural world when we're trying to, which is a kind of world of appearance, and we're trying to think about the processes and the realities behind that sort of world of appearance. And so it might just be argued that an example from something like evolution is inappropriate in terms of us understanding what an essence is. But what we can say is that the way in which evolution works generally is in terms of us thinking about selection, not definition. And so what is the way in which Socrates is working? And so we have to examine, in order to do this, how Socrates is making his arguments, as well as the arguments that he is making, the frame and the content. And that's one of the reasons we were thinking, or I was trying to get you to think last week, about the setting of the place, because when you're reading through the text, there's chunks of kind of argument, and there's chunks there's plainly chunks of argument. There are speeches. Phaedrus is organised into these speeches, and then there are these in-between bits, and there's and the first of those in-between bits is literally the setting of the talk. The next one, when we get to the myth of the cicadas, isn't quite the same, but we'll get there in a bit. So anyway, the point is that in terms of us thinking critically about how Plato thinks about essence, complicated thing to do, we have to try and have this doubled relationship, not just to the arguments themselves, but also to the way in which they're set, framed, organised, the images in them, all these kind of things. So I'm going to have a quick look through the first speech of Socrates and just take us through there. Now, the claim that Socrates is going to want to make in the end of this speech, or the claim that this speech is in a sense like to make, is that, and this is made at 239 in the Phaedrus, the lover, this is to quote, as a slave to pleasure, will inevitably try to derive the greatest pleasure possible from the object of his passion. And so, in effect, their benefit is your loss. Which is a similar conclusion, in a sense, to Lysias' speech in effect. It's a similar conclusion in effect, if not in content, in a sense, which is, in effect, to make you choose the non-lover rather than the lover, if you were to agree with the speech. Now, this is the argument that, in a sense, that Socrates makes here. I mean, we can look at this, I think we want to look at this in the seminar for definite, to sort of go through some of this a bit more. But for now, what I just want to do is just briefly sort of show you this argument. It's really straightforward. Love's a desire. How do we distinguish, someone in love from not? Then this idea about the structure of the human. and then this kind of conclusion that follows from this, that the erotic lover is just satisfying an appetite, and in my translation, it's as wolves of lambs, so lovers lust for young men. Now, as I said, that's the summary is the erotic lover is not a good thing, which is equivalent to the Lysias thing, the Lysias speech. What's important here is obviously that's the form of the argument, but this is almost immediately disavowed, and Socrates does this kind of disavow movement, using the notion of blasphemous. So the speech is suspended as soon as it's given. I mean, that's kind of by the person that's giving it, and he's kind of disgusted. I mean, and it's quite a visceral sort of suspension. He's quite disgusted with himself in a sense. But the way in which that argument is put forward is by describing a scene. And so Socrates' first speech is also the description of a scene. When I read it, it reads a little ironically. It's maybe describing, in some ways, the scene of Phaedrus' relation to Lysias. And in describing that scene, which, as it were, gives the setting for the argument, the way in which the argument is presented, the description or the narrative, it works, and the argument is able to be sort of presented through this particular description, insofar as the description or the narrative works to the extent that there's something true there, something's recognised there, and perhaps what we're recognising in the argument is this relationship to appetites. Now, that's kind of crucial, that there's something that it seems maybe not persuasive, but there's something that makes it even possible to believe it. Something possibly true that is recognised, difficult to pick out what it is, but as I say, maybe it's the appetites. But the other thing to note is that the character of the lover that's presented in this particular way is presented almost as a universal. It's not presented as one type of lover. And here, the reason for this is we want to begin to think about this idea. When we think about forms, they're often very, very abstract. By definition, the form of justice, the form of the good, these are kind of weirdly abstract. And so one way in which I want you to also encourage us to think about forms, and again, this is to lead us up to the Deleuze in a sense, is to think about forms in terms of characters, at least when we can. So when we talk about the form of the lover, which is the essence, the idea, the Platonic reality, perhaps, that we want to push to, then we can think about this in terms of a character, a particular kind of character. And so we want to look at the kind of way in which that character is described or presented to us in that first argument of Socrates, this argument that he disavows. Now, what I want to do next is kind of sort of move to the second speech, but what I'm going to do first is just give us a little bit of a kind of, I think, a 5-minute break in a minute, but give us a little bit of a kind of like indication of what's going to take place. So let's would we call this foreshadowing, perhaps? So Socrates is settled down with Phaedrus. Phaedrus has read out Lysias' speech. Socrates has basically said, it's beautiful, but I've heard it all before. Phaedrus kind of questions him about this, forces him to prove that he's heard it all before. Socrates then gives his first speech to kind of prove that he's heard all this before, that the lover's a bad deal, he's heard all this before. And he gets to the end of that speech, and then goes, "Oh God, that's terrible. That's really bad. We've just both blasphemed, seriously." So this relationship, this disavowal moment that Socrates has, is, I wouldn't say rationalized, that's not the right word, grounded on something like divinity. It's grounded on something like a relationship to this kind of entity or this space. And that relationship to divinity is going to be what we encounter specifically, in a sense, in terms of the role of myth. That's the role of myth within the Phaedrus, within Plato generally, perhaps. And the second speech of Plato is going to be sort of very heavily located in the world of myth. So again, what I want to note is that first speech is kind of telling of a story that was quite, in a sense, mundane, during the course of which an argument is kind of given. And in this second speech, again, there's a kind of setting, but a much, much more different setting, not mundane. It's divine. It's mythological, sure, but that's possibly not, that doesn't tell us the role of the myth. So the role of the myth is to, as it were, access this or bring in to bear this world of the divine. And obviously what that's doing, in a sense, it's the same kind of same kind of division that we're encountering in essence and appearance in the cave and the outside, in the divided line, etc. And so the myth and the divine, in this sense, if we were to be consistent with our Platonic kind of division between what's an essence and what's an appearance, if we were to be consistent, then the myth is the essence. The myth is the reality. And the lovers playing their games with words, manipulating each other, that's an appearance. Anyway, that's kind of foreshadowing a bit, but we'll keep going back to that, I expect. I'm going to take a break there. It's 27 minutes past. I'm going to put a little bit of music on and take a break till 33 minutes past, let's say.
not for paths left alone. 'Cause beyond every bend is a long blinding end. It's the worst kind of pain I've known. Give up your heart left broken, and let that mistake pass on. 'Cause the love that you lost wasn't worth what it cost, and in time you'll be glad it's gone.
That little bit there will definitely get flagged by Twitch. It's gone from Mike Shinoda, who is copyright free music, to Linkin Park. Well, anyway, we're doing the second half, and I want to look at Socrates' second speech. I'm going to try and finish at 5 or just before, so that we can start the Zoom seminar around 8. And in terms of the course, one of the things I remind you of is that the idea is kind of, we're reading through these texts, and so you will get the most out of this course if you read through them with us. And in terms of reading, then, up for this week, the idea was to have read up to about, I think it was 257, Phaedrus 257, which is the introduction to this second myth of the cicadas. But if you haven't got there, that's okay. You know, even if you've just got a few pages in, that's brilliant. Hopefully you've begun to get a little bit of sense of the way in which the text moves. And as I say, you know, think about the setting, think about when it moves from one kind of scene to the next, and kind of get a sense of that in your head. You don't have to be perfect about it. But getting that sense of that will give you a sense of you know, the text and how to deal with it. Particularly when we're talking about lines of argument that are kind of running through it, combined with the way in which they're presented. Now, just to return and sort of have another take at that essence appearance thing, and this is again kind of slightly foreshadowing what's happening next week when we'll look at the second half of the Phaedrus. So, in terms of reading for next week, get to the end of the Phaedrus. There we go. I should have mentioned that earlier. So, but to return to this idea of the essence and appearance, one of the things that's going to happen at the myth of the cicadas is we're going to change subject, or change subject matter, change the question. So instead of the question being, you know, is a lover better than a non-lover? The question will become, what makes good or bad writing? Remember, Lysias' speech is writing as well as a speech about a question: is what's better, a lover or a non-lover? And so the Phaedrus itself is going to kind of deal with both aspects, and that's traditionally the moment at which we kind of would say that the Phaedrus begins to talk about, after the myth of the cicadas, the Phaedrus begins to talk about rhetoric. And rhetoric is quite a polite word in a way. It's kind of what's underlying the conversation about rhetoric is, more broadly speaking, in philosophical terms, what we can call the problems of representation, because rhetoric is a mode of representation. It's one of the ways in which representational sort of structures, forms, you know, take place. it's not just it's not just the case that there's some some speech that's rhetorical and other speech that isn't. There is some speech that's much more clearly rhetorical than other speech, and there's a point at which maybe rhetoric, what we would call rhetoric, what we refer to as rhetoric in terms of speech, there's perhaps a point at which some other concept begins to be more interesting or more dominant. Maybe idiom or accent or all sorts of other things that might become more interesting. But rhetoric is a kind of mode of representation, a form of representation. And representation is going to be, as it were, the classical way in which the relationship between appearance and essence is kind of organised, thought about, in the sense in which, there's a representation of the essence. The appearance is a representation of the essence. Or not. So Socrates' second speech. Now, in the first speeches, one of the things they kind of agreed upon after having Lysias' speech was the assumption that being in love is a kind of sickness. And so even Socrates' first speech had kind of taken this as an assumption, starting point for where to go, to go from. And the starting point for Socrates' second speech is to basically, refute this. That love is not a sickness. And love is not a sickness precisely because, and it's described as divine madness, but what's kind of crucial there is it's an excess in relationship to the divine. But if we want to get rid of the word divine, then let's say it's an excess in relationship to the essence. Remember, I was talking about the idea that the myth and divinity, these are kind of possibly, equivalent or a way of the essence being presented. So the refutation of that first speech in which we agree that love is a sickness, or at least we use it as an assumption, the refutation of that assumption is made by this connection to the essence of love itself. And this kind of divine relationship, essential relationship. These terms are so kind of, I'm not sure they can even be really unpicked inside Socrates. Clearly they can kind of be unpicked in our secular philosophy, Western philosophy. That's good, maybe. But here they're in a much more ambiguous relationship. So if the madness of the lover in the previous speeches is the ground for its negative evaluation, here it's going to be grounds for its positive evaluation. Madness, excess, outrageousness, these are not frowned upon, Socrates says, by our ancestors. And in particular, he gives three different kinds. So you have, I think it's poets, prophets, and the cursed. A different kind of these madnesses. These are kind of inspirations. I mean, that's a much better way of thinking about this. And he says on 244, Phaedrus 244, the best things we have come from madness when it is given as a gift of the gods. And so that's also important to note, this idea that it's being given. And so there are two different models here that are pinning down the two different starting assumptions as to whether love is a sickness or not. In the first model, that model of human psychology that's given in that first argument about desire and the appetites versus intellect, that kind of crude model, in that model the excess of desire overwhelms judgment, whereas in this model the excess of desire is a kind of inspiration and it has a divine relation. So Socrates is actually, his arguments have behind them two different kind of models. Perhaps they don't necessarily have the same kind of character of what it is to be a human being or what a lover is in the background there. So perhaps if they don't have the same character, perhaps they're not maybe somehow talking about the same essence. Madness, this is again another quote, madness comes from God's sober sense is merely human. Now here it's important to recognise that this and inspiration is another word here. Inspiration comes from God's sober sense is merely human. Creativity, genius, there's a whole bunch of words that connect in a sense with being, self-moving, creative, coming from being new. There's a whole kind of stuff that's connected to the way in which the soul is also presented. Now, what's important here is that, in a sense, this is a kind of a framework that we might use in contemporary philosophy. What's being done is an example of a lover is being given in Socrates' first speech, and counter examples are being given in this second speech. And so we get counter examples, other characters. Yeah, other characters. So the character of the lover that's in that first speech, and then there's the character of the poet and the prophet, and different characters being used in the second speech. Now, the prophet's a kind of weird one because it doesn't sit easy with us nowadays. We possibly are not easily able to, we don't think prophet Nostradamus and that's brilliant, whereas we do generally think poet, that's great, So there's a kind of slightly different relationship perhaps we have to that concept of a prophet than Socrates or Plato did. But we could perhaps easily replicate that with other examples, musicians maybe, or artists. Now, the counter examples, what's important about counter examples is these counter examples trouble the negative implication of the mad lover that's kind of implicit in the first set of arguments in the Lysias and in Socrates' first speech. The argument there, remember, is like something like point 1, the lover is an excess of desire, intensity of desire such that it's a kind of madness, a loss of reason. Point 2, that the madness of the lover is not good for you because they kind of eat you up, or there's a consumption relationship, leading to the conclusion that the lover is of less value or less suitable as a suitor perhaps than the non-lover. Now what Socrates has done here in the second movement is allow that first one, that the lover is an excess of desire, a kind of intensity. They're allowing the intensity in, but they're challenging too that this madness is somehow just a process that will eat you up. So the lover here is not simply just going to have a consumption relationship to the loved. In order to change the value of judgment, in order to change that conclusion. But neither of them are arguing. The assumption that the lover was sick in the first is a second element of the intensity of the lover, the person being in love. So the intensity is being agreed upon, but that sickness health value is being changed, and then the conclusion is being changed. Now, we go through this amazing myth that you really only have to read yourself. I can't give you kind of, I'd imagine lots of people will get completely absorbed in the myth. It involves a charioteer. This is a classical image of psychology. It's one that we can encounter very closely connected to some of the stuff going on in Freud thousands of years later. The myth presents this amazing kind of story of life as a kind of charioteer ride following the gods, and you kind of cycle through thousands of years of coming down to earth and getting embodied and going back up on your chariot. And the chariot's got two horses, a black one, a white one, the good one, the white one, this intellect, and the black one, the kind of appetites, and the charioteer themselves. And it's it's great. You can read it yourself. It tells you an awful lot about kind of another way of life, maybe. I think that's kind of important. But what's important is that for us, in terms of dealing with the arguments, not necessarily agreeing with or using the myth, although they're quite impressive in their own way, is that in these myths, Plato, Socrates, they're clear that they're talking about the real. The region, this is to quote them from 247, on the Phaedrus 247, the region of which I speak is the abode of the reality with which true knowledge is concerned, a reality without colour or shape, intangible but utterly real, apprehensible only by intellect, which is the pilot of the soul. And so these myths are bound up in like this discussion of what is the essence. Now, we can reframe that myth if we want to. So we don't, you don't have to believe the myth to believe, or to have a sense of a complex psychology that's being developed inside this process, and that at the end of this, argument. What Socrates basically goes is that the person who is through their intellect perceiving love, perceiving beauty, there may be a struggle with appetites at a certain point, but actually anyone doing that is going to be able to, encounter such, as it were, positive feedback from, beauty, that they would not be able to sort of be overwhelmed by their appetites. There would be a kind of self-reinforcing mechanism for the person who's actually looking to the good, looking to the beautiful, and so that that's the lover themselves, and the lover here is very, very closely associated with the philosopher. And in that situation, you've got nothing to worry about. They are definitely without a case, to answer. The best thing you could possibly have. This is what you're encountering in love, when it's a true love, when it's authentic love, when it's love that's connected to the essence of love. And that's kind of, that argument we can kind of reconstruct. We can work on that a lot more, obviously, but that's kind of the general gist of what he's trying to say in this second sort of presentation. And the mythology is presenting this. The mythology is presenting this kind of case, and the way in which this case kind of lives in the world rather than is just in our head. So the important thing, yes, the charioteer myth and the myth of the kind of karmic cycling, that's all kind of important to know, but the important thing here is that relationship to divine madness is a kind of positive relationship to excess, a positive relationship, in other words, to high intensity. Let's say that it's the way in which we're trying to deal with things, the way in which we're trying to argue about things is not just with clean propositions, but it's with characters and counter examples. That the mythical stories are actually the stories that kind of indicate the thinking or the way in which the essence, the real, is being conceived, and and this is something to sort of pick up on next week, perhaps, a little bit more. But that relationship to what's often called divinity, and what is presented as divinity inside Socrates, which is going to come back again, that relationship to divinity is in some sense a relationship to something like infinity. Something like the highest intensity or the best, or it's an intensive relationship. That's trying to be described, a qualitatively intense relationship, and it's not to specifically necessarily a theological entity. Right, so I'm going to finish, as I say, in 5 minutes or so. I just want to just before I finish for the lecture for the day, so I've already mentioned this relationship to the cicadas that comes in, and so if you've got to that myth of the cicadas, you'll notice that you're beginning, you're changing questions, and so that's one of the things I want to try and be very clear about is that we're going to move to thinking about rhetoric as a kind of representational structure between essence and appearance next week, looking at the second half of the Phaedrus. Now, what I kind of want to just do very, very briefly is just caveat a very big absence here, which is obviously, if I'm reading Plato and Deleuze, in contemporary, what we might call continental philosophy or something along those kind of lines, these terms are a bit less used nowadays than when I was being trained. To talk about Plato, in particular the Phaedrus, without talking about Derrida's Pharmakon, would have been seen probably as terrible. So I'm talking about that. I'm not going to talk about Derrida's Pharmakon, as it happens, because I haven't got time. It's much more complex. So I'm just going to make a couple of brief comments. One, it's obvious, I mean, for those of you who don't know, the Phaedrus is kind of one of the core moments for Derrida's project of deconstruction. It's a kind of absolutely key moment, and the mythologies and structures that go on inside, in particular the second half of the Phaedrus, I would say, around the Greek, the Egyptian god Thoth, and all that kind of stuff. Really fascinating. Plato's Pharmacy, if you get some time, definitely have a read. Something that's a really, really interesting take on the Phaedrus. I think that one of the big differences between like Derrida and Deleuze here is that Deleuze is in a kind of more ambiguous relationship to representation. For Derrida, the structure of representation is kind of what's absolutely front and center and being deconstructed and reorganized, because that's in a sense plainly what is happening in what he calls the logocentric or the speech-centered tradition that originates in places like Plato's Phaedrus. For Deleuze, on the other hand, I think it's a bit more ambiguous. I'm not sure that he's at this point clear as to whether it's the structure of representation around speech or whether it's the process of creation and production that is kind of perhaps more important. Whether he ever gets that clear, I don't know. So we're going to kind of avoid Derrida, but if you're interested in Derrida, this is very, very close. Which is this what we're talking about in Phaedrus and Deleuze is very, very close, alongside parallel, cutting across, transversal. I don't know, but it resonates a lot with the Derrida stuff on the Pharmakon, and I will probably mention the concept of the Pharmakon next week a little bit, because it's a concept in the Phaedrus, and it's kind of crucial for us to have a clear idea about that. So that's just kind of sort of setting up some of the other stuff that might come up in the next couple of weeks. Reading for next week, try and get to the end of the Phaedrus. If you're, as I say, with the Free University of Brighton, then seminar should start about 8 o'clock. If you're not with the Free University of Brighton and want to ask questions and stuff, then this is on Facebook and Twitch, and there's stuff on YouTube quite often. You can get in touch with the Discord. Okay, I believe that's it for now. I will see you in a few minutes from FUB, and otherwise I'll see you next week.